Amy, are you doing the part of it? Okay.
Yes, and Brooke will do landscape, and then I'll do the other.
Okay. All right.
Right.
Yes. The judge has that to set his books on, or his, when he's, notes. Yes. But I moved it. Good to go? Okay. Well, folks, let's come back together here after lunch. Had a little bit, ran over just a little bit on lunch, but that seems to happen more frequently here. But anyway, we'll go ahead and get started. Jim's got one announcement from Pee Wee Valley that he would like to make before we get started with our other business.
Sure, thanks. Just so I don't forget this, Mayor Bob Rogers has invited everybody to Pee Wee Valley has a Yule log celebration Sunday, December 3rd at 5:30 to 7:30 on the town square. That's this weekend coming up. They have a bonfire, chili and hot dogs, live Christmas caroling, and a visit from Santa Claus, and the businesses are open. Mayor Rogers has been on the study review committee. He comes to just about every one of our meetings. So anybody that wants to go down there, I've been down there before. They have a big bonfire. It's amazing they don't set the town on fire. But yeah, 5:30 to 7:30 this Sunday on the town square.
All right, thank you. The other business that we have to need to look at this afternoon is some zoning ordinances updates, and the SRC committee has been working diligently on those for quite some time. So I guess we'll start out with our Division 300 landscape regulations. And Ms. Veman, I think you're up to bat here.
Okay, I trust everybody's read most of this, or tried, anyway. We started out with, staff started out with the task of trying to reorganize the landscape regulations that made them easier to read and understand by both landscape architects who actually create the landscape plans, but also the public, so they understood how they were protected by buffering requirements and things of that nature. So we had to go through and reread everything, remove things that, honestly, I'm the one that reviews the landscape regulations. Jim does sometimes and Amy does sometimes, but the past 2 years I've been doing that. So a lot of this has come from experience of reviewing them and seeing what works and what doesn't, but also with meeting with a couple of landscape architects early on in the process. So removing things that really didn't apply, or things that were just reiterated several times, and then reorganizing it into as many tables as possible and less words. There still are a lot of words, but we tried to at least put the requirements in a table format. So that's the major change. The other major changes, instead of, for our planting requirements, which are on page 6, changing the planting requirements from a zoning-based planting to a land use based planting. So instead of like C3, there was a chart that had, if something's zoned C3 and there's a development that's C2, that told you that you had to have a low opacity or high opacity or medium opacity buffer, which no one really knows what that is. It's kind of up to whoever's reviewing the plan at the time. So we changed that to determining, what the land use is of the property, because sometimes there's a tract that's zoned commercial, but there's actually residential units in that tract. So under the old landscape regulations, technically they would still have to install, if they're abutting a residential property, what the commercial zoning landscape requirements are, even though it's a residential land use. So we switched that around. We think that's going to work better for more tract-tailored landscape regulations. We also added a species mix, which was not previously talked about in the regulations. One of the suggestions we got from Ann Richard, who is with LD&D, a landscape architect with LD&D, who we work with a lot, was that a species mix should be incorporated in our regulations, and that's to allow for more biodiversity and less a chance of blight. You know, if a disease comes in and attacks one type of tree, then majority of those trees are going to be removed. So based on the number of trees required, there's a different number of species required. So that's a major change. We did add tree installation and planting standards, which we did have, but we consolidated those into a table and reiterated how much of a green width or a verge space would be needed, and that's on page 3. Sorry, I'm skipping around here. There's a lot of changes. I just kind of want to hit the highlights and let you ask questions. We still have vehicular use area planting requirements. Those have not changed, other than some of the heights have gotten taller. If it's, you know, closer, you know, within 30 feet, we did increase the height of anything that's adjacent to a residential use. And then we did, on some of them, change the minimum number of trees per linear feet. But that was based off of looking at many different landscaping plans that were submitted and seeing what works when you actually go out and look at the site and see what's installed. Scott, as you all know, may know, had some comments on the landscaping regulations, so we did try to incorporate some of his comments. Those are mostly related to the green infrastructure portion that was been added. Let's see. And basically what we added there was we're trying to promote some green infrastructure, especially with lots that have high impervious surface. So in order to promote that, we did allow for tree wells or rain gardens, things of that nature, to be implemented into the project, and some of the other landscape regulations could be waived if they do that. But Scott, as the county engineer, would have to review and make sure that that meets the stormwater requirements, and that was incorporated into the landscape regulations. We did remove, per his comments, that basically a distance from that trees would be planted close to any permanent roadway or sidewalk, because there are so many different situations where there may be a utility line, or maybe the road is maintained differently. We just felt that, and Scott felt that it would be better to leave that up to the county engineer to review on a site-by-site basis. So that's all I'll cover. I didn't want to do a formal presentation. It would be a lot. Didn't want to overwhelm you. So I'm really here just more for questions if you have them.
Before I let Jim speak here, I want to just fill everybody in or give you just a little update on, especially for the new commissioners and the folks that are probably watching on community TV. The SRC committee, study review committee, meets once a month, usually on Thursday night, next door here in the conference rooms. And it's made up of 5 members of the Planning Commission: myself, Mary Ann Smith, Dina Crosby, Jan Horton, Bob Klingenfuse, and then Jim always attends, and then both staff, Amy and Brooke.
Mayor Dybel.
And Mayor Dybel, and usually Mayor Rogers is there, and then all the community's invited. A lot of times we have developers there. We'll have, a lot of community interest there or whatever. So, we've vetted all of this information has gone through a pretty extensive process, through the study review committee, and then, we make a recommendation from the committee to the Planning Commission, because the Planning Commission then, will vote on it and send it to the legislative bodies, which would be fiscal court, and then the 3 cities that make up the combined planning unit. So that's the process that we're doing today on these, the landscape regulations, school capacity, and subdivision consideration. That's what we're looking at today, and what we'll make a recommendation hopefully today and send it on then to the legislative bodies. So, Mr. Urban, do you have anything you need to add?
Well, you did a great job of explaining the background on this. The only other thing I was going to add is that there's a approved and prohibited tree species plant list. Paul Capiello, who many of you know is the director of Udell Gardens, we asked him to review our landscape, our tree and plant list, and he was already on a committee in Louisville and said, well, once we get it developed, we'll just let you have it. So that's what this is. For the region, these plants work. And then there are prohibited trees based on either they're disease-prone or they're invasive or cause some problems either with leaves or berries dropping, whatever it might be. So I thought it was very helpful that Paul was willing to share with us what the work that Louisville did.
It's also great because they're classified by size and what's best for a street tree, what's best for like a deciduous buffering tree. So that's made the review of landscape regulations and the tree species a lot better for staff and for proposals. I also want to add one more section that was added was code enforcement and fines. We have a lot of questions, I'm sure that you all have seen, about how do we enforce these regulations and keeping these trees planted and pruned and maintained. Before, we didn't really have a section that talked about how to enforce that and what fines could be levied if they don't comply. So now we've added this section that basically just states that if they don't comply, they have a certain amount of time to comply. If things are not added correctly, that we can take them to the code enforcement board and fines can be levied until it's remediated.
Okay.
That's it.
All right, and folks that are here, this is a public hearing, so it'll be just like a zoning hearing where we'll take on any public comment or any questions. I'll open it up here in just a minute to the commissioners. If you all have questions, concerns, whatever, we can hopefully address those. But I'll ask, I guess, first, is there anyone here that would like to say anything or testify or have any questions before we move into the commissioners? Okay, we'll open it up now for commissioners. If you all have any questions for Jim or for Amy or Brooke, either one, we'll certainly, or the members that serve on the SRC committee, are available to hopefully answer at least procedure questions and how we got here. So, Mr. Douglas?
Can you just share with us, Jim, how that works when, because I think I know, but, just for the rest of us, how the process is when a developer or builder comes in with their plans and when does a landscape plan come in effect in that process?
Sure. Yeah, the landscape plan is usually submitted at the same time as the construction plan set. Backing up from that just a little bit, things like we see today, a preliminary subdivision plan or a preliminary development plan, they'll accommodate the landscaping requirements. In other words, they have to make sure that they put in at least the width and dimension and even sometimes the intent of what their landscape plan is going to be, but they don't necessarily have to show what the plants are or talk about really quantities. And we review it based on, is it generally going to meet the intent, especially for things like the buffer areas. That's the biggest deal in case they need a variance waiver or whatever. But when they finally get everything approved and they're submitting construction plans is when they submit the actual landscape plan that's reviewed and either commented or approved. And then they do the installation of the landscape plan during the construction phase. And before we release any either a certificate of occupancy or give a certificate of completion on the whole project, among other things that get reviewed on the site is the landscape plan for compliance with the approved landscape plan.
So, as it comes to the commissioners, when it comes to landscaping, buffering, screening, it's only when the commissioners put a binding element or stipulation in for increasing or certain types of plants or whatever, when, like say, if we have testimony from the public that says, I want a bigger buffer zone or I want something different, that's where the only time the commissioners would have input?
Yeah, generally the landscape plan is a staff review level. And like you were suggesting, that if during a hearing a buffer area is either altered, either larger or smaller, that's discussed. Or if somebody wanted something more specific, we had a commercial case where somebody was asking for a fence along with landscaping to provide a stronger buffer. And so we can add binding elements if it's discussed during this phase of a project development.
Now, I know that, and I'm asking this because it has a little concern of on the stormwater management board that I'm on, a lot of discussion from outside has come in to ask about the green infrastructure area. So how does that approval process take place? I mean, if I was a developer and I come in after I've got all my approvals and I go to Brooke with my landscaping plan, and I'm a general contractor or I'm a builder, do I just, I put in the request that I know what I'm supposed to have, but is there any suggestions? Who else reviews those plans? Like, will Brooke go to the MS4 coordinator and say, hey, you see anything in these plans that might suggest where we could do a green infrastructure that we could suggest to the developer? Or is she just going to take the plans and stamp them and say, that's it?
Well, good question. I got to sort out my answer for a second here. The landscape requirements, just like stormwater management and even sometimes signs, are typically considered from the very beginning of a project development. They aren't necessarily at the tail end where now we finally go, well, let's sprinkle landscaping in here. Especially when there are dimensional requirements on the plan, like a certain width of a landscape buffer. It has to be in there, or else they're going to have plans that don't get approved because ultimately you got to add them in later. When the design professionals are putting together that development plan, typically they try to make sure they consider all the regulations and requirements, whether it's green infrastructure, stormwater management, traditional methods, landscaping. And again, even early, sometimes they'll put a proposed sign on a plan just so that it's already being reviewed and no surprises. Most development, when they get to the end, before they even purchase the land sometime, they want to have all their approvals in place, and then they close on the property. So again, it's a design process where they're bringing in all the component pieces. In terms of an opportunity for green infrastructure, sometimes it's initiated by the design professionals because in some cases they don't have enough room on their property for, let's say, traditional detention basins. So they're going to propose alternative methods for dealing with stormwater early on because they know they have to detain their water somewhere, somehow.
You still didn't answer.
So, well, the part about whether the MS4 coordinator gets to see it during the review of the engineering, the construction documents, is where everybody coordinates and has a conversation on the first floor downstairs regarding the particulars. And sometimes there's a little kind of give and take between a landscape requirement and a stormwater requirement, especially things like easements and all the other utility easements. So again, that's all kind of put in the whole design process of a development.
Okay.
I'm not sure if there's still a missing question.
Well, I just want to make sure there is from not just this board or this commission, but also from the other board, that when we have a neighborhood or somebody comes in and complains about the water runoff that was approved by this commission, that we didn't consider green infrastructure, or we didn't consider enough stormwater buffering or detention basin or swells. So, are we addressing that, or are we just going to stamp it by somebody saying, okay, they met the minimum requirements? That's the only reason why. Is there a chain of events that goes on here?
What we've added regarding green infrastructure, and I only know a little bit about green infrastructure. I don't know enough. I'm not a landscape architect. I'm not an engineer. So I don't know enough to be more specific than what we have now. But we did add in planting requirements that the ILA requirement could be waived if green infrastructure was implemented. And that, of course, is with the approval of the MS4 coordinator, and the county engineer. So if someone comes in with a landscape plan and they want us to waive the ILA requirement, and they do submit their green infrastructure plan, I would give that to Scott for review. I would review it to make sure it fits in the landscape plan, but in order to make sure is actually doing its purpose to reduce water runoff and so on, I would submit that to Scott for review, and I would not approve the landscape plan until that has been approved by Scott or the county engineer, whoever that may be.
That wouldn't be your decision to recommend to the developer, hey, instead of using the ILA, how about using a little bit of infrastructure?
Well, it's
Would
in
you
our
do
in our
that?
standards now.
Yeah.
What we're proposing.
I understand
so-
that, but I could.
Well, and
We had a developer sitting right here, and if I talk to him, he's going to say, you know what, I got so much time in a day. I drop off my paperwork, I come in, I communicate. I'm not going to sit there and go over what I can and cannot do, you know. So I guess my question would be, Mr. Harris, you represent my board, so I got two other members that are going to ask me questions
Yeah,
about this.
well, let me jump in here too. You know, usually we have a pre-app conference with staff.
Right.
And Scott is involved in those. So again, early in the design process, we're talking about all these elements, whether it's landscape requirements, whatever, including stormwater management. So very early in the design process, we're talking about whether or not they can handle stormwater through a traditional mechanism or something different. And I'll jump to
We
like.
do, but if I may, stormwater is the last thing finished on a set of plans.
Well,
It's always talked about, it's never implemented. I just had a 4th design review with a very reputable engineering firm. My TRC comments still haven't been addressed to stormwater. They've submitted 4 times construction drawings, and they still haven't been addressed. It's the last thing, always.
Well, but that's, yes, but that confuses this conversation because I think what we're getting at is when are these recommendations proposed? And they're proposed in as far as I'm concerned, and I'll give you an example, the Walmart in Crestwood. We had no requirement for green infrastructure, but there are bioswales and there are tree wells that we, in the very beginning, said, you really ought to consider doing this. And Walmart stepped up, their engineer stepped up and made an attempt to handle it. So, yeah, the details of stormwater management are sometimes left till the end in terms of the calculations and everything, but they're always discussed even in a pre-app meeting. Now, whether an engineering firm carries it out at the beginning of their process or at the end, that's up to how they're going to propose it. It makes it harder if they don't address it earlier. We would hope that they would.
It just drags the process on.
It
Yeah.
drives the process on. So I think if I'm
I
hearing
just
your-
want to, I know that the state's getting ready to change their MS4 permit requirements, and part of that is strong emphasis on the green infrastructure. So, you know, if we're making these changes, everybody should be aware of what's coming down the pike to encourage our developers to implement these and to follow, because if not, you know.
That's going to be rather hard in the direction the development in the county is going anyway. Typically, green infrastructure takes more area, takes more space. Smaller house, more impervious area. Smaller lots, more impervious area. That's the other way. So, you know, it would be very hard. We are encouraging them to use it. We can't mandate it at this point. I don't know what the new MS4 is going to say, but
All right,
Let me
any,
just add one thing. We did ask Burger King, sorry, we did suggest, they were at, if you remember, they were at like 64%, and the requirement is 65% impervious surface. Instead of them going over and asking you for an impervious surface waiver, we suggested that they implement green infrastructure and add tree wells. So we do that, and then as the commission, you know, if they're asking for an impervious surface waiver, you can add a condition of some kind, or ask them if they tried to implement any kind of green infrastructure before coming to you for the waiver.
Yeah,
So
and we do have-
we do discuss.
Right, and we do have projects that have put in some components of green infrastructure. Are they the greatest effort? Not necessarily, but I mean, we can walk down 53 and, you know, the first one you come to is the liquor store where they put pervious pavement. And like the Cub Bank where they did pervious pavement, rain gardens, rain barrels, and all kinds of stuff. So we historically have made an attempt to try to convince the development community to use green infrastructure early in the process. Now, whether they end up doing it or not, like Scott said, it's not mandated, but we've got some successes with it already.
Well, Bluegrass Ice Center at Crestwood was
Bluegrass
another one
Ice
that,
Center, I was trying to think of their name.
Yep,
Yep.
quite a bit of things. So, any other questions for staff? Mr. Horton?
It just popped into my mind here. At what point will the developer and so forth get this list of suggested or required trees and shrubs and so forth when they apply? Say, here, take this with you, and this is what you're going to choose from, or
It will eventually be in here, in our subdivision regulations,
so-
zoning ordinance.
Okay, so it'll be in there, and you won't have to mess with it there. They need to know what all of it is, including this. Okay.
Correct. It'll be at the very end of that section. I
And
don't know
it's
if
an
you
appendix
noticed.
of.
Yeah, on page 13, it'll be added to this page.
Ah, okay, good. Thank you.
Appendix, it's right in that section.
It's in
of
the section
yeah,
then, okay.
Section 300, right, yeah.
Good.
So
Thank
don't
you.
have to go searching for it.
All righty, Ms. Smith?
I have a housekeeping question. This is, I should have asked this a long time ago. But when this is being done piecemeal, like we have to do it, after this is approved by all the bodies, should we then put this in our notebook? Is it effective as of the date that it's approved by all the bodies? And then that's incumbent on the applicant to go by these rules, even though they're not in the book
Correct.
per
And it's,
se.
Well, they are in the book, and we have an electronic link to this
You're doing it
scattered.
that way.
This scattered
I'm
kind of.
still a paper
yeah,
person. I
it's-
love paper.
It's a little confusing till we get through all
When
of
you
it.
go to our homepage on the Planning and Development
And then it-
website, the
and
first paragraph speaks
Got it.
of the last set of documents that were amended
Okay.
recommended by the Planning Commission to the legislative bodies. And there's a link, and you click on that, and it's everything that's in there. So we'll do the same thing on this.
On
Now there will
this.
be a second paragraph that says, on this date, these following areas were recommended for changes or approvals or whatever, and we'll have a link to that ordinance for that. So once we get through of what we're doing, then we'll incorporate it all into a new book. Everyone will
Right.
get new books, and it'll be a
But
complete
I had meant
comprehensive
to
document.
ask, because somebody applied several months back, and there was a discussion about they used rules that,
Yeah, it was the difference of uses in R2 and R2A or something of
something
that
like
nature.
that,
Right,
but-
Barry Baxter. Right,
okay, thank
correct.
you.
Yep.
Sorry.
all right, that's all right. Hey, any other questions? City of LaGrange section?
In landscape regs?
The only difference that they have is a 5-foot versus, and everywhere else in Oldham County, a vehicular use area buffer. So the buffer between the parking lot and the property line, and the street typically. In LaGrange, it's 5 feet, or has been in the past. And then in Oldham County, it's 10 feet. I don't think that's been changed.
And all of the legislative bodies have that option. They can, the fiscal court can make changes, City of LaGrange. We hope in the end that all four agree.
still
and
there.
that they all have the same, language in all four documents, but they don't have to. It's an ordinance, so they can make changes even after our recommendations.
That was the only differentiation between LaGrange and everywhere else. You may be thinking of sign regulations. They have a different sign ordinance. That's the first I've heard of it. Oh, are you talking about the prohibited and?
While they're looking at that, I just wanted to, I missed mentioning Greg King. He was not here today, but he's also serves on the SRC committee as vice chair, and I serve as chair of the committee. So I didn't mention his name because he wasn't here today, and I missed him. So
What is that?
There's a section that's.
300, 180, I think. They have their own.
But it's the same.
Yeah.
I don't know what's the same. I mean, that's just something you would have to ask them.
It has deciduous trees, but we still use that.
Yeah,
Deciduous tree, I think it might have just been.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, any other questions on the landscaping regulation proposal? Ordinance, yes, sir, Mr. Klingenfuse.
Code enforcement on the last page. That's going to that affects all existing developments, is that right? Like,
Well, the regulation is only going to apply to developments that have not been proposed yet until it's passed. But we do code enforcement in terms of looking at previously approved landscape plans and whether or not they've been installed and maintained. So if somebody is not, if the plants have died and they haven't replaced them, we can take them to code enforcement regardless. It's not spelled out in that section, but we can still do code enforcement for violation of the ordinance.
okay, say a development got done 10 years ago and had a landscape plan, but trees have died, they'll be replacing those?
Yes, that's number 4.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, any additional questions? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to ask Mr. Urban if he would outline what we need to consider here as far as a motion and you know, on this update.
Well, just a motion to recommend to the legislative bodies that we adopt these landscape regulations that have been brought up from the Study Review Committee through the Planning Commission.
Okay. All right, you've heard the recommendation, or what is the pleasure of the chair would now entertain a motion on the zoning ordinance update recommendations to both fiscal court and the 3 cities, Pee Wee, LaGrange, and Crestwood, for their consideration of the landscaping regulations, Division 300. What's the pleasure of the commission? Mr. Klingenfuse.
I move that we recommend these changes to the,
Legislative bodies.
yes.
Okay. I have a motion to approve these zoning ordinance updates on Division 300 landscaping regulations to the legislative bodies. Do we have a second? Okay, got a second? Okay. Oh, Kevin, all right. That'll be fine. And is there any more discussion or any further discussion on the motion to approve? Ms. Smith?
When you all were discussing regulations for the city of LaGrange, I'm not aware of that.
Okay.
Will you,
Well,
There's not separate landscape
I
regulations. for the
wondered
city of
about
LaGrange.
that.
The only difference is there's a 5-foot buffer required in the city of LaGrange versus a 10-foot for the rest of Oldham County. Mr. Douglas was talking about, in the prohibited and approved plant list, there's a mention of city of LaGrange trees, but there's not a separate table that shows that those are different from what Oldham County is. So I think maybe there was a typo, or they
Okay.
had planned to put different trees in there at some point and just didn't get to it, but that's gone away
just wanted
as a part
to
of this new.
clarify before I vote on something?
Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Any further discussion on the motion to approve? Okay, seeing none. Oh, sorry, Mr. Douglas.
On the code enforcement, back to Mr. Klingelfuss. On number 4, landscaping that has never been installed, been removed, damaged, or diseased, is that just, I guess, a clarification on that? Is that just for, like, say if there's a development that's been done, just like Mr. Klingelfuss said, after 10 years, who goes back and replaces those?
well, it should be the property owner or the original the applicant, but that may not be the same person any longer. So all of these get transferred. If the property gets sold, then it's the
So we're going to have code enforcement go out and tell somebody when
yeah,
to plant a tree?
if they have not maintained.
Do we do that now?
Sort of. I mean, we don't go look at every old landscape plan, and I know as an example, there's, sorry? Yeah.
We've had for example, some complaints about Oldham Oaks. I know since Mr. Edwards developed that property, it's since been transferred, so he would no longer be liable to go in and replace the trees that have died. It's whoever the new owner is of that apartment complex. I'll go back and look at the approved landscape plan. If he doesn't have, whoever the property owner is, if they don't have those same trees planted, or if they've died or are in disrepair, we can send them a notice of violation and ask them to replace those. It starts out with a courtesy letter typically. If it's not installed, then at that point it becomes a notice of violation, then they move on to the code enforcement board.
That all,
It's a lot to keep up with.
Mr. Klingenfuse?
I was under the impression that 1 acre tracts weren't affected by this much. It was mostly the developments. They are?
All non-residential are regardless of lot size. If it's something that falls, if it was developed after the landscape regulations were put in place.
So, okay.
Okay, any further questions on the motion to approve? Okay, seeing none, I'll ask Ms. Fox if she will take the vote on the motion to approve the zoning ordinance update recommendations to the legislative bodies of Division 300, the landscaping regulations. A motion to approve.
Mr. Klingenfuss. Yes. Mr. Mesker.
Yes.
Mr. McWilliams.
Yes.
Mr. Neal.
Yes.
Ms. Smith.
Yes.
Ms. Bonet.
Yes.
Ms. Crosby.
Yes.
Mr. Douglas.
Yes.
Mr. Halfland.
Yes.
Mr. Hampton.
Yes.
Mr. Gordon.
Yes. Didn't hear that.
Trails out there.
I didn't hear a light voice in the distance.
Be a late afternoon, a little bit. Okay. All right, the motion to approve the recommendation of the zoning ordinance update on landscaping regulations has been approved on a vote of 11-0. And Mr. Urban has informed me that we can vote on the next one on voice vote, so we will do that. And, okay, Ms. Alvey, school capacity standards, Division
Yes.
27050.
Okay, so school capacity standards, this is part of the capacity ordinance and everything. We have been working on this for several months. Staff has been working with Michael Williams with the Oldham County Board of Education on this. So we'll start and go through it as it reads. The purpose, nothing was changed in part 1. Part 2 says, previously it said as a part of consideration of any request to rezone property. So this made it an implication that if you had a subdivision and it was zoned R2 and you wanted to put 400 lots on it, it was not subject to school capacity because it was not part of rezoning. So we said as part of the consideration to subdivide land, correct, yeah, for available public school capacity shall be considered. So we took out that it wasn't part of just when property was to be rezoned. I have glasses on and I still can't see. Okay. And then we just changed some grammatical in there. Instead of Oldham County School Board, we put Oldham County Board of Education. So you'll see that multiple times, red line through there. And then number 4, it talks about the students generated. Mr. Williams comes in every year normally in December, January, February. And then that's where he has done the projections, and we get the average number of students per building permit. And that what we put on here, that's just kind of been, it says periodically, but we've done that annually. So we just kind of updated the language there that said the form and method of arriving at the figures, data, and other information relating to students generated per dwelling shall be annually reviewed for accuracy and relevancy at a planning commission meeting by the end of each calendar year. So we'll do it at the end of each calendar year. He's gotten his student populations for each school and education level and everything, and Michael's Rain Man when it comes to numbers. So he'll have that information ready for us by the end of the year. So we wanted to put it in here so that it would be done at the end of each calendar year. So that is part 4. Part 5, this is where you will see the biggest change. Previously, under mitigation, it talks about A, B, and C. Those all were there. D, the word was just phasing. We didn't have any teeth into the language of what does phasing mean? How does phasing work? So again, staff worked with the Board of Education on the process of coming up with some type of mechanism to allow development to still continue, but on a paced base or growth based off of what the school could absorb for students per year and building permits. So under phasing, it just says Oldham County Board of Education has adopted the campus capacity worksheet, which is a chart that averages the combined school capacity of the serving campus, campus being the elementary, middle, and high schools serving that development, and applies a multiplier to calculate the number of building permits allowed per calendar year for the proposed development. And then this is kind of the same generic paragraph from the previous one where we get the number of students per building permit. This is the same paragraph, but detailed for this part of phasing. It says the form and method of arriving at the figures, data, and other information relating to the campus capacity worksheet shall be annually reviewed for accuracy and relevancy at a planning commission meeting by the end of each calendar year. As part of this review, the commission may request from the Oldham County Board of Education its raw data and formula used to determine the multiplier. The commission, through its staff, may review this information to determine its accuracy, fairness, and comprehensiveness, as well as review for other pertinent factors. These are three key factors. The number of building permits allowed are cumulative on an annual basis per calendar year. So previously, if a development came in and they were allotted 40 building permits, they came in 2017. We would have in the binding elements, in 2017, they got 40. 2018, they got 40. So this is now based off of, we have changed it in one other area under the subdivision regulations portions, which we'll get to later, is that you only get the number of building permits once you go to record plat, not at the time of planning commission approval. So they can't bank all of these years of building permits because they've never even gone to record. They haven't submitted their construction. It may be 2 years, 2.5 years, and they've already got 80 permits, building permits on the table ready to use. So that's not really smart planning on our part to allow that just to kind of pile up. So with this mitigation, we will allow them to accumulate on an annual basis per calendar year. So if, once we get to the chart, if someone is allotted 20 building permits and they go to record in August of 2017, they'll get 20 building permits. If they only use 10 of those, the other 10 carry over to the next year. So they can accumulate from year to year. So in 2018, they get their 20 plus the 10 that they did not use. So we're allowing them to accumulate per calendar year, but again, it'll be based off of what the capacity of the campus is. And I know this is a lot for those that weren't on study review to absorb, but the applicant can petition the Planning Commission for revision of the binding element if additional capacity becomes available. If a development comes in and they are at 120% capacity at that campus, and say, we'll just go on and turn it over. So at 120%, they can have they'll get 15 building permits per calendar year. The Board of Education does a redistricting, or they open another school, or they add an addition on to a school, and the capacity changes for that campus, for that development, and the campus goes down to 101%. So the developer can come back to the Planning Commission and petition them to allow them to go from 15 building permits per year to 32 because the factors have changed. There's a new school, they've an addition, there's been redistricting, something of that nature, if they feel it is beneficial for their development. So there won't always be tied to the number that the Planning Commission puts on as a binding element. It can change based on the factors of the campus capacity changing, like again, additions, redistricting, new schools. So that is that is the main change that we've talked about with phasing on there. So this is a campus capacity worksheet. So if you look at this, and again, Michael worked diligently on this information. So we have single family on one column and then apartments or multifamily in the other column. We had a recent case where there was some school capacity issues for development. That was for multifamily. That school campus was at capacity. So we were trying to figure out, well, do multifamily developments, do we get the same number of kids? You would think you'd get less kids from apartment complexes or multifamily than you would from single family, and you don't. You actually get more from apartments than you do single family. So, and that's based off of, we have a list of apartment complexes. Michael knows where those kids come from, where they live, where they come. So he can equate that to the number of units to the number of students. So that's how we came up with the differences there. But again, a development comes in and they go to the Board of Education for their Board of Education letter, and Michael does the numbers, and they're at 110% as an example. They would be allotted 23 building permits per year based off of the average capacity of the 3 serving schools, the elementary, the middle, and the high school.
Those are cumulative.
And they are cumulative, correct, from per calendar year. So, somebody left their glasses. So, Michael can give you the information on how he came up with those numbers and the multiplier on how that was done and how this fits into their capacity planning as well.
Michael, if you would.
Okay. Where to start would be the better. This has been the brain trust for what, the last 6 months? More than that.
Michael, for the benefit of those that have never seen this, start with how you a quick tutorial on how you come up with the school capacity numbers, student population,
Okay.
algorithm. Start with that, because that, if you don't, then that piece is missing for the general public.
Okay, for the general public's consumption, how we determine capacity at a school. There are state standards issued by the Kentucky Department of Education that create, based on the number of rooms we have, available space we have in a building, determine the number of students that can adequately fit in that building. Those numbers actually have been changed in the last year, and if you've seen any of our capacity letters, you notice that some of the schools went down in capacity, some of the schools went up in capacity. So that's where we really start with all of this, is that number basically issued by the school or by the KDE. From there, you look at the number of students we have in that given boundary area. That gives me my general percentage of enrollment or percentage of capacity. In all of that, every year for the new commissioners, we do growth projections for the last, and I will again credit Dr. Arvin for his astuteness in that creation. I have made minor tweaks since I have inherited it, but on average, in the last 10 years, the averages, it's been about between 98.2 and 99.6% accurate every year. The lowest it was the year that the bottom fell out of the economy, and I think it was 96.8% accurate every year. So I roughly know and can tell how many kids. Now, I can't do it as specifically on a school basis. I can tell you district-wide, this is how many kids I expect us to have. This year we were at 99.82% accurate. So again, it holds very true. And so we use that in our capacity letters. So all of this came about, and we started talking and looking at a way that as growth is coming back to the county, we can't get in the same shape that we were in before we started capacity planning, where we were growing 600 students plus a year and couldn't keep up. And that's one of the nice things. And if you ask, Mr. Schultz, our superintendent, he loves the fact that we have at least a voice in this conversation. Most districts don't. And so working through this, we have come to this point of, we started to look at, okay, how do we get to a point of numbers that we can manage bringing into our buildings, but that still would not prohibit all growth in the county. And so this has gone through, 5 or 6 different configurations. I mean, even just for SRC, it's gone through 3, I think. Before that, I was looking at 14 different variables trying to hone it down into a list, and could never get it to consistently hold the numbers that I felt like we weren't shutting down growth in the county. So we got it to this point, and basically, when you look at it, you start at 95% of capacity on that campus. We don't have a single campus right now that's sitting at 95% of capacity, obviously. But we have some that you saw today that was 103 point something. And I'm going to round those numbers to the closest whole number. I'm not going to try to break it even farther out. So you'll look at, where does that fall in that scale? Well, during the conversations, I had it starting at one point, and when we talked with the builders at SRC, it became, okay, well, we can live with 35 because the average number of permits that any subdivision was granted in a year was, 33, 30 something at Brentwood. I think it was Brentwood for that year. So, we put that as the starting point, because that seemed to be a consensus among the builders that said, we can do that many building permits. And then we took the multiplier, and I looked at the multiplier, and I said, okay, how do I go to a point of, and then establish, we had it going all the way to 0. But again, that would shut off growth in the county. And so the recommendation from the builders and members at SRC were take it to 15. And so looked at it on both charts. How do you go from 35 to 15? Well, based on the numbers and how you see the capacities increase, when you see from 95 to 100, 95 to 99, it only goes down by 100th each time. And then as the capacity increases in that campus, we start to slow it down a little bit more. Each year, we're going to look at those numbers. These numbers will come back to you just like I bring the number of building permits, students per building permit number each year. We're going to look at these numbers each year. My guess is they'll hold pretty consistent from year to year. I don't know that as a fact, but we'll get to that point once we start to review it each year. But we did have to look at how do we slow it down, and looking at the multipliers as that capacity increased, how do we have to slow it down to give us time to develop the capacity that we need? And so that's where those numbers really worked out from. Does that answer your question in a very long-winded way?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I'd say, you're looking at basically managed growth. I mean, how do we manage growth in Oldham County to where, the schools can keep up and not get where we were back in the, 10 years ago or whatever.
Right.
Okay. All right, let me open it up before we get questions and whatever from the commissioners. Let me open it up. Is there anyone here that has questions or wants to start or anything that you'd like to add? Okay. All right, commissioners. Let me get Mr. Klingenfuse, and then. Is your mic on?
How bad does school capacity have to get before you can build a school by state?
Well, there's multiple factors that are going to play into that. One, every elementary school, every school, if we're considering building a new school, every school in that age cluster, so if we're talking about building a new elementary school, every elementary school has to be at a minimum of 85% capacity. Right now, we're not there with all of our elementary schools. I'm not going to publicly hint at this, but you understand where I'm going with that. Eventually, we will need to level and balance those enrollments. So that's already a conversation that started internally for us.
So with schools at 85% capacity, you can build another one?
If we see and can justify the growth to the state, to KDE, we can, at every school being at a minimum of 85% capacity, if we can say, yes, we know this growth is coming, they will give us the green light to start the planning process for a school. Now, so that you also understand, it's basically a 3-year process for us to put a school in the ground. You have a year of planning and 2 years of construction. So.
Okay.
And at what point do you look at moving kids around? As far as what kind of, do you have a number? You get 130%. You look at.
There is not a great number, and it's hard for us. Elementary schools are different, so we have to look at all 3 levels differently when we talk about redistricting or balancing enrollments. Elementary schools is a self-contained unit in and of themselves. Those students, other than the related arts, don't really leave that classroom on a regular basis. So the more kids you have to push into that school, you're going to create an issue at each of those grade levels. So we're going to look at that probably sooner than we would look at a middle school or a high school where you have the ability of moving students from classroom to classroom. It's also not optimal at the middle school and high school level, but you can have what they call teachers on a cart. And you can use an available classroom. Mr. Williams is shaking his head yes. I think he remembers the days that South Oldham High School were teachers on a cart. That a teacher can go from room to room and teach in a different room and still utilize that space and not have an empty classroom at any given time. I will say this, and you look at the numbers, and you all know the numbers. South High is at 137% of capacity. They may have 2 or 3 teachers that teach in a cart. There are still open rooms because of the way those schedule structures work. There are still open spaces in that building. So we understand it may not be at the high school level that we have to go, okay, at 137% of capacity, we need to redistrict. Because if you look at the boundary lines, to push kids to North High, you're going to the doorsteps of the other 2 schools to balance those enrollments. The other factors that come into that, we have the Arvin Center, which takes some students away 2 periods a day. It doesn't increase the capacity at the school, but it minimizes the number of students in that building at any given time. We also, for the upper level kids, for the seniors, a fair number of them either attend JCTC, U of L, Bellarmine, all of that. And so they're sometimes not even in the building at all on a given day.
All right, additional question. Mr. Douglas, do you have something?
I've always wanted to know this, and since you're up here, I get to ask this.
Uh-oh.
Every time we have come across the school capacity here on the commission, and there is a binding element that there may be a mitigating circumstances where we say only, like today, 40 building permits could be issued in the first phase. How do you, I'm assuming for that school capacity, if it was at 103,
Correct.
is 40 building permits based on the number of students possibly enrolling in that school, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Next month, we have another commission hearing for that same school. How do you know what the school capacity, if it's still 40 again?
Historically, that's why we're looking at changing this. It's been every time it's 40.
Yeah.
Phasing is 40. And so, hold on.
The reason why I asked that is because I know that happened last year. We ended up approving some developments that was, the school capacity was like, we were supposed to be 25, 30 or whatever, and then like 2 months later, we did the same thing. And I'm like, well, shouldn't we have deducted something somewhere?
Okay, in the old form, and I keep a running list of what's been approved, how many students we should get out of that. And so that you know, when that multiplier comes out, it's K-12. I can't project how many high school kids we're going to get out of a given subdivision, whatever. We have, through all of this process, actually changed the form so that you will actually see that number 4 would be something new on this form for you all. It will actually say other approved developments in the campus area. So I included Heather Ridge at this point, which the net growth out of Heather Ridge based on 72 homes is 23 students. So that number then now comes down and plays into the final capacity number. That's the number, that 103.59. That's the number that I will use on this chart for the next subdivision. It was, but it was done just in my office. It was never visually seen anywhere.
Okay, any additional questions? Mr. Klingenfuse.
Making sure I understand. So your capacity, to what we did today, that lowered the capacity on that school campus, if it goes through.
If it goes through. Okay, so what happened, and Mr. Klingenfuse, I use this as an example because I used Heather Ridge in it. Okay, so you look at, if you come across to the campus and you look at, okay, so here's the rated capacities and the planned capacity. Here's the number enrolled, okay, and then their projected enrollment for the next year, okay, which only puts them at 102.79. But then I add in those 23 students that are potentially coming from Heather Ridge, puts them up to 3,003 students. So that 3,003 with the 2899 gets me the 103. And so if, let's say, we have another subdivision come that's going to be in the Buckner, Oldham Middle, Oldham High campus, until Heather Ridge is built out, you will see Heather Ridge, and then you will see the thank you, Commons of Cedar Point listed on there with the number of students that I expect out of that development.
The 23, those are the phased ones each year
That is the total.
for the whole?
For 72, that's the total. For 72,
Remind him of that every year. You tell us that.
okay, so when I come each year and I give you that, my little handy dandy chart, and down at the bottom I say the number we're recommending is this year it's 0.326. Okay? When I have a new subdivision, I take that 0.326 and multiply it by the number of houses. That 0.326 for Heather Ridge netted me 23 students, K-12. Okay? Here, the 102 in the Commons at Cedar Point nets me 33 students.
Okay.
So I have that running chart in my office, and now, like I said, you all will now see it in the capacity letter that says, okay, Heather Ridge has been approved, the Commons at Cedar Point has been technically approved. Those numbers need to start to decrease our capacity in that campus area.
And those students are spread out through all 12 grades.
K-12,
We don't know exactly where they're going to be till they enroll.
correct.
How long will those, what happens in the case where a development quits? How do you determine when that, are those numbers taken back off ever on some developments?
I have never taken a number back off.
Well, you may have, like Buckner Crossing had 500 houses,
Right, but
but it expired.
it expired. I guess technically, yes, if it officially expires, then yes, I would remove those numbers. Like I haven't counted, and I know it's coming, but Summit Park, I knew it died, and I hadn't included those numbers in that boundary area, but I don't think we've actually had one in that boundary area because I'm trying to think. I think Locust, Oldham Middle, Oldham High boundary area.
Well, the one we did today has been through a couple times. And so, as long as somebody could pick it up and continue that development, you kept those numbers on the books?
Correct.
Mr. Douglas, before you get to you, is there anybody else that have questions? I want to be fair to everybody, here, so, okay.
Mine was just short. Is this like that document, internal document, just for Board of Education, or does the principals see that too
They get that number each year.
each year?
Yeah.
So I noticed that seemed like every time you present one of those, that high school mark, especially for like Oldham County High School, is pretty high.
South High is actually higher.
Is it?
The state, South High's original capacity was listed at, I think, 1,050. Thank you, 1,053. The state reassessed the school and lowered it to 1,019 students as their capacity. So that literally pushed their building capacity percentage up to 137%. So that will be the highest school you will see. I will also tell you that down the road, it's been put into our facility plan that South High will get a major renovation. What that looks like at this point, I don't know. I'm not on that side of that world. I'm on the here, how many kids can you account for side of the world. And so that will change it. And once the building, and now I forgot the name of it. What the state issues to us that basically.
Talking about the LPC and the.
No, the BG1.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
so once we get what's called a BG1 from KDE, we actually will start to increase that. Already go ahead and list that added capacity because we know that construction's coming.
All right. Any other questions before we move on here? Mr. Plainview?
A lot of questions. The developer can keep accumulating those, the school the right to build the building, the houses.
Each year, it accumulates each year. So like Amy said, if they came and went to record plat in August, and is it calendar year or is it calendar year from date of issue?
Calendar year.
Okay, so in January, let's say they got 20. In August, they used 10. January 1, they get another 20. So they'd have 30 for the year 2018.
That's only at record plat, which means that they've gone to construction plans. It's not just sitting out there and doing extensions of
They've got some roads
expirations.
built.
It's gone to construction, correct. It's gone to record, lots are ready to be sold.
Okay, I had a concern that somebody could do this and sell the right to build 200 houses.
Right. No, it's at record plat.
Okay. My other concern is with 35 houses a year or in one campus area versus 15 in another one. If you had a development that had 300 houses in it, and at 15 houses a year, it's 20 years to build it out, versus the other one, you're looking at about 8 years to build out. So when you go with a campus plan like this plan will decide where development occurs in the county.
But we've always used the campus number. We've never used an individual school number.
But it's always been 40. It's kind of mute until you start actually enforcing it.
But again, they can also, as capacities change in our buildings, they can come back and say, can we now they can come back to you all and ask, can we now, the school capacity is now this, can we have that new number?
I'm not in a big hurry to build a lot of houses. I don't want to, the 35 is plenty high. It could have been lower in my.
Well, we haven't really talked about that. We had a great discussion about 40, 35, and 30, and Michael had gone through this chart with all of those numbers. And the SRC, I think it took 2 or 3 meetings of discussing what number, and so we weren't random, what number and then what the minimum was that would work. So, I mean, this was heavily discussed among the development community, elected officials, SRC members, research, to come up with a fair and balanced number. And it was reduced by 5 to start with. And then a floor was created, this 15, saying, okay, that's the minimum number you'll get. And then again, we had already moved towards at record plat. So we're kind of refining this whole process.
All right, anything else? No, okay. Any other questions? Okay. At this point, I guess we're down to considering a motion, like we did the last time, on the school capacity recommendation to the legislative bodies. So the chair would entertain a motion at this point. Mr. McWilliams.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I move that we approve a recommendation to the county's legislative bodies on all of the changes that were presented to us today of Section 270-050.
Okay. Is that an adequate motion, sir? Mm-hmm. Okay. Have a second. Okay, Mr. Halfling, seconds. Any discussion now on the motion to recommend to the legislative bodies approval of the revised zoning ordinance on Division 270-050 school capacity standards? Any discussion? All right, I think we will do a voice vote on this one. All those in favor of the recommendation to the legislative bodies on the subdivision or school capacity standards signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Okay, those have been approved. All right, the last thing that we have today for consideration is the subdivision regulations.
No, there's one more after that.
Oh, I'm sorry, okay. Article 3, subdivision considerations process. Ms. Alvey?
Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
So this talks about the process of going through developing a subdivision, or even just cutting off or dividing, doing a simple minor plat. The first one just was some grammatical changes there in the first paragraph, and then we changed the division and action required. We changed those a little bit on there. But it just talks about the different types of divisions. Easement plats, that's adding or removal of any type of easements, and then it tells what steps that they have to follow in order to get through that process, which is 1 and 6. Then minor amendments, minor plats, and consolidation plats, those are approved at staff level, and those are steps 1, 5, and 6. There's been no change to that. That's what we currently practice now. And then the last one is major plats, which would be that of a subdivision plat. That requires commission approval, and so they would go through all of the steps on there. This section will relate back to our extension of expiration policy, which is our last item, which is an internal policy of the Planning Commission. It's not incorporated into the zoning ordinance, so we'll do that one last. But previously, it said that all final plats shall be submitted for review and approval within 3 years of the preliminary plat approval. So that means that because we do phasing. If an example, as Bobby said, that if there's a 300 lot subdivision and you're only allowed 40 per year, how can you submit all of your final plats within 3 years? So that didn't work with the arrangement of doing phasing. Then up here it says, when requested, 1 year extension of approval may be granted by the commission. In granting extensions, the commission shall have the right to require amendments to the approved preliminary plan when it finds that applicable ordinances and regulation, land use plans, local land uses, or development conditions have changed since the approval. That was originally below in another paragraph. That's the same language. It was just moved up, so that's just a relocation. And then it says approved final plat shall be recorded within 6 months. I'm not sure, since I came to planning and zoning 7 years ago, our stamp that was always used said it expires in 1 year. So we were stamping them, telling them that they had to file their record plat in the clerk's office, or their plats within 1 year, when the regs said 6 months. that's not really been an issue. So we just changed it to the 1 year to match what the previous practice had been.
Well, and it always had been 1 year, as long
Yeah.
as I can remember, but.
So I'm not sure that was something on there, so. And again, then if you look, this paragraph that was highlighted here or struck through, that was the paragraph that was implemented in the above one. Under postponement, it says the commission or its designee may postpone its decision pending further study of a plat. And then it goes on and it says, but in no event shall its decision be postponed more than 90 days from the date of filing at any step in the process as outlined herein. Without the consent of the developer can request postponement but beyond 90 days. Postponements are really regulated through KRS 100 when the planning commission is required to make a decision within 90 days from the application date. So that really doesn't need to be put in there. That's all outlined and regulated through KRS 100. So on amendment and revocation, we just put amendment before revocation. And this is where it says a plat previously approved may be amended by action equivalent to that which approved the original plat if additional lots are being created or a roadway created or eliminated. If no roadways are being created or eliminated and no additional lots being created, then the amendment shall be treated like a minor plat or consolidation plat at the discretion of the administrator or be referred to the commission. So if a development comes in, they're not adding any new roads, they're not adding any new lots, they're really just rearranging the existing lots or due to road alignments, that can be reviewed and approved by the administrator, or if Jim's not comfortable, or the administrator's not comfortable doing it, they can refer that to the commission. So we added that or be referred to the commission because we've had that happen in the past. Says, well, the reg says that you can do it, and so sometimes we like to have full transparency in the office and for everyone in the public. So well, that's not how I remembered it, or if they have something from a neighborhood meeting or our meetings, and then it's built differently, and they're like, well, how come? So that gives Jim the ability to refer it to the commission, so for full transparency. So in step 3.3, pre-app meeting, nothing was changed there. Under pre-preliminary plat, at this stage, the second paragraph there, it says at this stage, a meeting with identified neighbors is required to facilitate the identification of potential resolutions of community concerns for all subdivision plans. Originally, the neighborhood meetings are only required, or we only required them previously for zoning map amendments. But we feel it's good that even if the property is zoned appropriately, that the adjoining property owners are notified by the developer so they have an opportunity to work out any kinks before they get to us in the public forum. So that's why we added in here for all subdivision plans. So any subdivision, any land that will be developed into a subdivision will now be required to have a neighborhood meeting. The subdivider will need to provide the commission staff with a list of first-tier adjoining property owners. It says second-tier property owners. Those adjoining the first tier within 500 feet are to be notified only if the plan is part of a zoning map amendment request. Certification that each property owner listed notified of the meeting to discuss the development is also required. So this just clarifies that second-tier property owners are only notified when it is part of a zoning map amendment. So that was a little confusing to some because when they read it, they thought, well, we're not doing that a zoning map amendment, just first tier and second tier. So we tried to clarify that as much as possible. Down on step 3, this talks about a subdivider wishing to divide land in Oldham County and required to submit a preliminary plat shall do so only in accordance with the substantive procedural requirements contained in these regulations. The commission shall hold a public hearing as part of its consideration of any major preliminary plat, which would basically be a subdivision plat. Any plat that involves a request for waivers or deviations from substantive requirements of these regulations, or that proposes developments of an environmentally sensitive area as defined herein, is required to have a public hearing. So basically, any plat that comes through our office that would require any variances or waivers would require that process. That does not allow staff to grant variances or waivers. So, or just spelling that out. And then any minor plat complying with the substantive requirements of the regulations as determined by the commission staff shall not require the holding of a public hearing. So if it's a minor plat and someone's carving off an acre for their child to build a house on it, it meets all of the requirements. That is reviewed and approved at staff level, and that is the current practice today. Step 4 talks about construction plans. On here, and it just talks, this was part of the review that we had discussions with the county engineer on construction plans. It says, upon approval of a preliminary plat and prior to construction of any physical improvements to the subject property, a subdivider must submit a soil and erosion control plan simultaneously with the construction plans as required by local, state, and federal agencies, providing technical data concerning the location, type, and quantity of specified physical improvements and or infrastructure. Construction plans are to be reviewed and approved by the county engineer. The soil and erosion plan must be in place before any earthwork may begin and shall comply with all Oldham County ordinances. So again, sorry, that was off the screen. That was reviewed and discussed, and I worked with Scott specifically on that section when it came to soil and erosion and what that process would be. And then step 5, again, this is the one where it talks about preparation, submittal of final plat. We just removed that whole section of the paragraph that says that the final, requisite final or record plat conforming to the approved preliminary plat is not submitted for review and approval, whether in total or in phases within 3 years of the date of approval of the preliminary plat, then the preliminary plat is considered void. So that's basically saying from the time that you guys approve it, they have to go to record with the entire development within 3 years. Well, that's impossible to do if anybody, right now, if anybody has more than, what would that be, 30, 60, 90, 30, 60, 90, 105 lots. Because if they could get the max number of lots of 35 per year, this is saying that once they go to record, they would have to build out, go to record within 3 years of your all's approval, which is nearly impossible to do, obviously, with our phasing plan. So we just removed that portion from it because that defeats the purpose. And again, the recording of the plat, we just changed that again. Any plat not recorded within 1 year after receiving all necessary approvals shall be deemed null, void, and have no effect. So we took out the 6 months, moved it back to 1 year. And that's all I have on that. Mm-hmm.
Any questions on this proposal? Seeing no hands go up, the chair will entertain a motion on the subdivision consideration process, Article 3, for recommendation again to the legislative bodies.
Come on, guys, this is an easy one. Dang, missed your chance to get your name in the minutes.
I've been holding out since I'm on the SRC, so I'm waiting for someone other than an SRC.
Do you want me to defer this to you, Mr.?
Mr. Neal got his name in the minutes twice.
That's right. You better relax.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I move that we recommend approval of Article 3 subdivision consideration process, all of the changes that have been shared with us by staff today to the county's legislative bodies.
All right, you've heard the motion. Adequate? Okay, do we have a second? Kevin Mesker, okay? Any discussion? on the motion to approve these recommended changes to the legislative bodies on the subdivision consideration process? Seeing none, we'll do another voice vote. All of those in favor of the motion to approve these changes being sent as a recommendation to the legislative bodies on the subdivision regulations, Article 3, subdivision consideration process, signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Okay, those have been approved. Ms. Elliott, I think you said you had one more?
Yeah, the last item today. This is just an internal policy for the extension of expiration. We really didn't have anything in place that limited the number of extensions that a developer could get to keep postponing their extension request. So the first one just says the policy shall be renewable by the Planning Commission every 2 years. So every 2 years, I'll bring it back. I have it on our calendar every 2 years to come back, and we'll renew this policy. Applications for extension of expiration date shall be submitted to the Oldham County Planning and Development staff. So the expiration applications come to staff, and then we follow the procedures of what we have here in place, which is outlined under number 3. And it says, if the plan has not expired, a copy of the application and conditions of approval shall be forwarded to the members of the Technical Review Committee with jurisdiction over utilities/services for the development. Technical Review Committee reviews the extension of expiration request and makes a determination as to whether capacity is still available. If capacity is still available, then the request may be approved by the administrator, rather than every year they come back to the Planning Commission. Item D says, if there are capacity issues or there is a proposed change to the plan to accommodate capacity issues, then the plan or extension of expiration request must go before the Planning Commission for review. So if staff gets comments back from the water company that they can no longer serve it, or the fire department, something of that nature, the plan is required to come back to the Planning Commission at that time, and it will go through the hearing process. Then we added item number E on there. It says maximum number of extension requests to be approved by staff shall be 4. After 4 requests, the plan must be reviewed by the Oldham County Traffic Consultant to determine the review category as outlined in section 390.040 of the Oldham County Comprehensive Zoning Ordinance. So basically, if they do not start construction to go to record plat within 6 years from the date that the Planning Commission approved them, because they have 2 years from their time of approval, and then they get 4 one-year extension requests. So they have 6 years to go to construction, basically, have their construction plans and everything in, and to get to record. If they do not, within that 6 years, they will be required to come back to the Planning Commission for a review of the plan and ask the Planning Commission for their extension of expiration. Because it's one of those things, is how long do you let somebody just keep extending without, because a lot of things can change. And that's why we asked for the Oldham County Traffic Consultant, because that will determine, they'll go back out and look at what the anticipated trips are, because you could have a vacant piece of property that's had 10 years of extension requests. Well, you have 3 subdivisions now down the street from it that have all developed. Well, that may change now what those traffic concerns are on the road, because, it's just been sitting there idle and not doing anything. So we were trying to figure out what would be a trigger for the review process, and we've determined that it would be, the best would be traffic, the traffic counts, and under that section 390.040. If the plan has expired, then the plan shall be reviewed by the Oldham County Traffic Consultant to determine the review category as outlined in section 390.040 of the Oldham County Comprehensive Zoning Plan. So basically, this extension of expiration policy update is saying that it limits the number of extension of expiration requests that can be reviewed and approved at staff level at 4. There was no cap previously. So we're capping it at 4. And then after 4, they have to go to section 390.040 and follow that procedure that's already in place. Yes, sir, Mr. Mack.
Just one quick question, Amy. Is there any point, or whomever, is there any point at which a developer exercises all of the extensions? I mean, we've done that now. I mean, you're out of them, and they still have not gone to construction. Do we what do we do then? We say you have to start it.
We're saying that you would be required to come back to the planning
Start
commission.
over. So that's our teeth in it. It's just you got to start all over again.
Well, and it would be part of that review process to ensure that traffic has not changed,
Right.
water, school capacities,
Right.
sewer infrastructure, all of that. A lot of that can change in 10 years.
Absolutely.
If you just keep extending, and then they're sitting here on the side
Yeah.
and not having to
Okay.
be brought up to today's standards.
Thank you.
We've got several examples in the county
I know we do.
that are stretched way out there that are just sitting there that are still getting, approved or getting extended.
So,
Or they face expiration. Right. They just give up.
they would just give up.
They could, yeah.
Okay.
All right, I'm sorry.
Let's consider construction phase. Once,
Construction plans.
Yeah, they have to have approved construction plans into the county engineer's office. And once those are approved, then they can go to record plat and they post their bonds. That'll have to be done within 6 years now.
okay, and let's say they done record, and they recorded it. They've done their construction, but they still haven't started, or they've semi-done construction, develop roads or cut out paths or whatever for roads, but that's as far as they get. So what happens then? Does the clock still ticking on the 6th of expiration? I mean, it's very easy, I guess, to take your construction plans, a developer, come in and get approval and say, we're going to do this, then send a bulldozer out, cut a path. You know where I'm going with this, because there's...
Yeah. I think all of that ends up costing them money. If they're not going to move forward, they typically aren't doing that much. It's possible.
So how does that interfere with this at all? I mean, because technically they're in construction phase, even though they haven't been out there in 3 years or 2 years or whatever. What happens? I mean, I can see this
We
as...
scratch our head and go, wow.
Well,
yeah,
but you
I
see
think-
what I'm
I
saying?
think
We're
that
not
would-
protecting ourselves as far as the
It could
county.
happen, yeah.
We're just letting somebody just hang out there, and once in
Yes.
a while we send code enforcement out and say, hey, soil erosion sediment, silt fence is gone, you need to come prep it back up. But what, we're not, this is good, but I don't think it's effective.
Yeah, we only have 3 projects now that are receiving extension of expiration, so I don't foresee that being an issue. And I guess we would have to address it at that point and bring that concerns back to the planning commission on that specific project. But like I said, we only have 3 projects that are receiving extensions of expiration at this point, out of all of the subdivisions that have been built.
The ones that are, I know I'm not. The ones that have started, is that considered still under
No.
construction?
They've started, they're
If they've
kind of in the process,
Yeah.
right.
Right, but it may never go into
If they've only done
completion.
section 1 of 4 sections of the development, they don't have to keep extending for the other 3 sections.
Right. So if they've just gone in and bulldozed a couple like roads and never come back in 3 years, 4 years, it's just what's an abandoned property.
Well, then we have bonds. We should have bonds and stuff in place at that point that hopefully would cover any improvements that they did not complete.
Yeah, but in terms of their ability to move forward or not, or expire or not, yeah, it's I'm trying to think of if we actually have a case like that, and I can't think of one. I know
Mr. Chairman?
We've had some that have dragged out, but.
Is it ever in the purview of the commission to say to someone who's had multiple extensions, who, they're out, to say, okay, well, let's say somebody's in, they've got a 4-phase development, they developed the first phase in 6 months, and they haven't done anything for 4 years. Is it within the purview of the commission to say, okay, you now have 6 more months to develop section 2, a year to develop section 3? I've not ever, I wouldn't think so.
Once they get going, they have the ability to go at their pace.
Yeah, pace it themselves.
You know, like back during the recession we had 10 years ago, whatever, when bottom dropped out of everything.
Yeah.
A lot of these developments just basically froze in time. You know, they just quit, or they went out, you know, they went
Right.
bankrupt, or the banks foreclosed on them, or whatever. They just sat there. They continued to come in and get extensions, and in a lot of cases, you know, Billy Delker of the world or somebody came in and picked up those properties and then moved those, you know, moved them forward. So, you know, that's happened several times, you know, but,
And part of that is because the capacity has already been considered by the utilities or agencies. So like the Board of Education, once they go to record, once they get construction plans, though, we heard Michael say that he keeps that in that as already occupied capacity. If they have to pay sewer taps, if they've had to make road improvements, you know, those have already been accounted for. So the next sections, even though they may have stalled, we're still considering that their infrastructure has been accounted for.
No one suffers from that situation other than possibly the developer.
Yes, yeah.
all right, any further questions? All right, seeing none, Chair would entertain a motion on the extension of expiration policy recommendation, again, to the legislative bodies. We have a motion. I've been looking down here, but I'm gonna look over this side. This time.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make the motion that we recommend to, and I'm assuming to the legislative body, the extension of the expiration policy that was outlined today? Or does this necessarily need
Not
to
to the
be?
legislative.
Because this is for the
internal
commission,
policy.
that's what I
Sorry.
thought.
Yeah, it's just for.
That was my fault.
So
Sorry.
a correction will be a motion to approve the extension of the expiration policy that's been drafted by staff and reviewed by us here today.
Sorry, that was my fault. So, that'd be great. Okay, we've got a motion on the floor on this internal document on the extension of expiration policy, that it be approved as submitted. Have a second. Do we have a second? Okay, Mr. Hampton, second. Any discussion now on the motion to approve the expiration of extension of expiration policy, sorry. All right, seeing none. All those in favor of approving this motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Okay, motion carries. What do we have for next month, Ms. Alley?
You will have a revised subdivision, or preliminary subdivision plan. That will be on for next month, I know for sure. And then next month's meeting is on the 19th. So that is the third Tuesday, which is a fiscal court meeting, so we will have to be done by 2 p.m. So I'm not thinking of anything else that will be on the agenda for that day. But we had to move it due to the holiday, so.
Right. And we will not have SRC on Thursday night, correct? This Thursday night?
This Thursday, no, sir, we will not. It is December the 11th at 5 p.m., which is a Monday.
All righty, thank you all. We will stand adjourned.
When do you get that off, or when are you supposed to be functioning? Because I haven't seen much functioning today.
I know, dysfunctional. I go to get my stitches out on Thursday. That's when I'm supposed to start wearing this, but I already had this from the other foot. So I've been wearing it just to protect myself from, why not?
Thank you, ma'am.
When I put this on after the stitches are